wedlock is, we'll read later at the end of the chapter. Sometimes it could be, when you don't know who the father is, for example, might be problematic. But a child born out of wedlock to two parents that we know who they are is, it's again, I don't want to say fine, but we deal with it. Whereas the child that's born out of the conflict of a marriage, in other words, somebody went and had a relationship with a married woman, that's of course the classical case of the mamzer, which we're going to look at now. The reason why I say what the only theoretical resolution might be is because there is, what I did once here, and just by the way, to point out where it becomes tragic is of people who didn't know. And the classic example of that is a Jewish couple that got married and separated. And were just living in a time and a space where they weren't aware of the need for a divorce. And the mother then goes on and has another child with someone else. And years later, it will come out and there's essentially nothing that can be done. And that's a terrible tragedy. And what we're going to take a look at now is the details of that halacha. Okay, so everybody see that? Okay, do you see this? Ezehu mamzer. Okay, chapter 15. What is meant by the Torah's prohibitions against relations with a mamzer? The term refers to a person conceived from a forbidden sexual relationship. A nida is an exception. Now, as he points out here in the footnote, this refers to a variety of incestuous and adulterous relationships. A son conceived from such relationships is blemished, but is not a mamzer. Okay, in other words, when the mother is a nida. When, however, a man enters into any other forbidden sexual relationships.
Rabbi, sorry to interrupt. The screen seems to have gone blank, Rabbi.
1 second. 1 second. I don't know why that happened, but I'm going to.
It was there and then it went blank.
Okay, so I'm going to close it and then I'll reopen it if that's okay.
Yeah.
1 second. Now good?
Not, yes. Yeah.
There, now we got it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, please don't feel embarrassed to correct me when things go wrong. A mamzer should, both male and female mamzedim are forbidden forever. As the Dvarim states, a mamzer shall not enter God's congregation, also the 10th generation. In other words, the prohibition is everlasting. In other words, they're not allowed to marry a Jewish person, obviously not allowed to marry a non-Jewish person, and children that they have will carry that status. When a mamzer marries a Jewish woman or a Jewish man marries a female mamzer, once they enter in relations after consecration, they are punished by lashes. If the man consecrates the woman, meaning he's mekadesh or under the chuppah, but doesn't enter into relations, doesn't receive lashes. If they enter in relations without consecrations, let's say they had a relationship together, they don't receive lashes because of relations with a mamzer. The only instance where relations that involve a negative prohibition incur the punishment of lashes without the woman being consecrated his relations between a high priest and a widow, as will be explained. When a man remarries his wife after she had already married another person in the interim and divorced, by the way, obviously, just to be clear. So Mr. A, okay, John, we have a John in our class. Let's use another name. Jack marries Sarah, divorces her. Sarah then goes and marries Greg and divorces Greg, and then goes and remarries Jack. The offspring are acceptable. She is not considered an erva. The reason why the offspring are the reason why he points out that the offspring are acceptable is because if you remember, that is quite a serious prohibition in the Torah to remarry one's original wife after she had another marriage. But we're just saying the Torah describes it as an abomination, but the Torah says it's still the children are not mamzerim. When a Gentile or a servant enter into relations with a Jewish woman, the child is acceptable, whether the woman is married or unmarried, whether she was raped or engaged in relations willingly, the child is still a Jewish child. When a Gentile or a servant enter relations with a female mamzer, the offspring is a mamzer. When a mamzer enters into relations with a female Gentile, the offspring is a Gentile, and if the child converts, he is fit to marry within the Jewish people like other converts. If a mamzer enters into relations with a maidservant, the offspring is a servant. If he is free, the offspring is acceptable like other freed servants. He may marry a Jewish woman. Okay, and there was a story about 50 years ago with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein where he allowed, I actually have not seen this tshuva printed, so perhaps I shouldn't be repeating it because I didn't see it documented. I heard it at the time, not at the time, shortly after. They allowed someone to travel to a society in the world where there is still the idea of having a maid servant. In other words, today it basically doesn't exist anywhere in the world. But at the time, there still was the idea of acquiring an employee that you owned. He was allowed to have a relationship with a child and then free the maidservant. She would then become his wife and be converted. And the child, so it would be a permitted relationship, and the child would be a Jewish child. Anyways, just a story. This is the general principle. When a child is born from a servant, a Gentile, a maidservant, or a female Gentile, he is like his mother. We are not concerned with the father. For this reason, the sages permitted a mamzer to marry a maidservant to purify the lineage of his descendants, for he can free them, and they will be freemen. Again, it's exactly the story which I just referenced. Our sages did not ordain a decree forbidding a maidservant to a mamzer so that he can legitimize his sons. In other words, this is the only out, so to speak, in terms of a mamzer having a child. When a person who is half a servant and half a freed man engages in relations with a married woman, a son born of that relationship has no way of legitimizing his marriage relationships, because the dimension of him, which is a mamzer, and the dimension of him, which is an acceptable Jew, are intermingled. Therefore, he is forbidden to engage relations with a maidservant and his offspring, to share his status forever. Now, how could you be a half a servant and half a freed man? Any suggestions? Either you're free or you're a slave.
Yeah, but you're owned by two people.
If you're owned by two people and one of them frees you, then it's a problem. And such a person, a half servant, a half Jew, can create a half mamzer, and there is no way for the child to redeem himself. When a Gentile engages in relations with a maidservant who immersed herself, the offspring are servant. When a servant who immersed himself engages in relations with a female Gentile, the offspring are Gentile. He's given his mother's status like every child. When, however, a Gentile engages relations with a Gentile maidservant, or a Gentile servant engages relations with a Gentile woman, the status of the offspring follows that of the father. Now, what we're referring to here, when we say an Eved, okay, a servant, a Gentile servant, a servant is a very unique status, which we don't have today. But that is that they were somewhat Jewish. They had to go through a semi-conversion process, and on being freed would automatically become Jewish. So in such a situation, a semi-Jewish Gentile maidservant, a semi-Jewish servant, his status follows that of the father. Zion. Mamzer mutar lisa giyodes. A mamzer may marry a female convert, and a female mamzer may marry a male convert, and the offspring of both relationships are mamzerim. For the status of the offspring follows that of the blemished one, and the license of such a marriage is derived from the verse of mamzer should not enter God's congregation. The congregation of converts is not considered as God's congregation. In other words, they are as children of obviously when we say here, we don't mean that they're, God forbid, not considered part of God's congregation. What we mean is that in terms of marriage, their status does not have the tribal status that a Jew by birth would have. But obviously today, it's not considered a solution because a convert would marry any normal Jew and have, or any fellow convert and have regular Jewish children. They would not want to perpetuate by choice this unfortunate situation. When a female convert marries a male convert and gives birth to a son, he is permitted to marry a female mamzer, even though he was both conceived and born in holiness. And this also applies to the son of his grandson or any other descendant until his connection with conversion is forgotten and it is not known that he descends from converts. Of course, the most famous descendant of converts is Rabbi Akiva, right, who himself was one of the greatest teachers of Torah throughout all of time. And he very proudly carried that ancestry. Afterwards, he will be forbidden to marry a female mamzer. Converts and freed servants are bound by the same laws. In other words, a freed servant is essentially a convert. When a convert marries a native-born Jewess, or a native-born Jew marries a convert, the son of it is a Jew in all contexts and is forbidden to marry a female mamzer. Okay, so there are three categories of mamzerim. One that is definitely a mamzer. A mamzer's status is a matter of doubt, and a mamzer by rabbinic decree. What is meant by one who is definitely a mamzer? The offspring of a relationship that is definitely incestuous or adulterous, as we explained. A mamzer whose status is a matter of doubt is the offspring of a relationship that we are unsure whether it is adulterous or incestuous. For example, a man engaged in relations with a woman who was consecrated, but we are unsure if the consecration was effective or it was divorced, but we are unsure whether the divorce was effective or a similar situation. In other words, you're not sure. Okay, a mamzer in doubt. Now, the solution, the only solution that people can find today for a mamzer is if you prove that her original marriage was not a good marriage, which is not impossible to do. There are pretty clear ways of doing that. A mamzer by rabbinic decree, for example, a woman who heard that her husband died and remarried and then discovered that her husband was alive. Afterwards, her first husband engaged in relations with her while she was still married with her second husband. The offspring is a mamzer by rabbinic decree. Okay. Yud Aleph. When an unmarried woman becomes pregnant through a promiscuous relationship, okay, she wasn't married, she just became pregnant. We ask her what is the status of the fetus or this child. If she replies that it is the child of a man of acceptable lineage, In other words, with a Jew, not a Yisraeli, as opposed to a mamzer, her word is accepted and the son is acceptable. This applies even if most of the inhabitants of the city in which she engaged in relations are of unacceptable lineage. Okay, so even if there were many mamzerim in the city, if she says the father of the boy is a person of acceptable status, the child is acceptable. Yud Beis, if the child's mother was not questioned until she died, or she was a deaf mute, or intellectually or emotionally unstable, we consider the child as a mamzer whose status is questionable. This ruling applies even if she said, I engaged in relations with so-and-so, the mamzer, or with so-and-so, the nasan, as we'll see later what it is. Even if that person agrees with her statement, the child's status is only doubtful. In other words, we're not sure. The rationale is, just as she engaged in relations with the person who admitted to her statement, so too she engaged in relations with others. And this child is called a shtuki. From the word shtika, quiet, we don't know. He knows the identity of his mother, but doesn't know the identity of his father. And similarly, a child that is found in the marketplace is called an asufi. It is considered as a mamzer whose status is questionable. We do not know his lineage. Okay. Yudalit. The following rules apply when an unmarried woman engages in a promiscuous relations and she says this child is the son of so-and-so. If that person is of acceptable lineage, the son is considered acceptable. Nevertheless, her word is not accepted. Why? For the child to be considered as a man's son. Okay. It appears to me, however, that we give consideration to her words, and because of the doubt, that child is forbidden to marry the relatives of the named person. In other words, when a woman becomes pregnant, obviously today we have DNA testing, but the identity of the father needs to be confirmed by both parents. If the named person is a mamzer, however, we do not accept her word to definitely deem the offspring as a mamzer as basis we explained. Instead, it's considered the child as a mamzer whose status is questionable. Okay. Different laws apply with regard to a father who makes statements with regard to a child who is presumed to be his son. If he says, this son of mine is a mamzer, his word is accepted. If the son himself has children, however, his word is not accepted, for the Torah accepted his word with regard to the son alone. As the pasuk says, Ki esabcher ben hasnua, he will recognize the firstborn, the son of the hated, talking about the ben seder umeira. He makes his identity known to others. So his son's status he can define, but not his grandchildren. Just as a father's word is accepted when he says, this son of mine is a mamzer, or the son of a divorced woman, or the son of a woman who performed chalitza. Similarly, if his wife was pregnant, his word is accepted if he says, the fetus is not my child, it is a mamzer, the child is definitely deemed a mamzer. If a person says that he himself is a mamzer, his word is accepted with regard to the prohibition against him marrying a native-born Jewess. Okay, so a person can, on the one hand, just give himself a bad reputation. He is not, however, permitted to marry a female mamzer until it's definitely known that it is mamzer. We need to back it up. The same law applies to his son. If he has grandchildren, his word is not accepted with regard to the disqualification of his grandchildren. He can only disqualify himself. Okay. So now we have a sad story. A woman becomes consecrated, which is more than just engaged. She's mikudeshes, but she's not nasui. She never consummated the marriage. So she's still living in her father's home, and she becomes pregnant. The offspring is assumed to be a mamzer. He is forbidden to marry both a native-born Jewess and a female mamzer. If his mother was questioned and said, I became pregnant from the man who consecrated me, her word is accepted. The child is considered acceptable. If, however, that man contravenes her and says, I never engaged in relations with her, the child is considered a mamzer. Even if the child was assumed to be a son, his word is accepted if he says, my son is a mamzer. Okay. Then we say, even in the latter situation, however, the woman is not assumed to be a zaina. Instead, her word is accepted if she says, I engaged in relations with the man who consecrated me. And since she is not a zaina, if she married a priest, she need not be divorced, and offspring which she bears him are acceptable as priests. Yudches, if people at large gossip about her while she is consecrated, saying that she was promiscuous with the man to whom she was consecrated and with others. Okay, so let's say the town is talking. The child is a mamzer, status is questionable, even if the man to whom she was consecrated was intimate with her in her father's home, which is not permitted. But just as she acted loosely with the man to whom she was consecrated, she could have acted loosely with others. And if she was questioned, said the fetus was conceived by the man to whom I am consecrated, the child is acceptable as explained above. Okay. Now, this gets even more sad. What about a married woman who's pregnant and says the fetus is not my husband's? Her word is not accepted to render the child illegitimate. Instead, we assume that the child is acceptable. For the Torah accepted only the word of the father. If the father says that it is not his son or he's overseas, we assume that it's a mamzer. If the woman says I was impregnated by a Gentile or by a servant, the child is acceptable, for the husband cannot deny her words. In other words, the husband says, it's not my child. He's believed. But let's say she says, well, yeah, it's true, it's not your child, but it's a Gentile father. Right? If you remember, with the Gentile father, the child is not a mamzer. Right? The husband can't deny it. So the husband's now throwing his toys out of the cot. His wife is pregnant while she was married, and he wants to run away. She says, all right, fine. Just so you know, the child's not a mamzer, though. Yeah, no. He doesn't know. The fetus will not remain in its womb for more than 12 months, and therefore the mother can make that's the absolute longest that a pregnancy will go. Although, of course, today we go with a much shorter. The gynaes will be calling for a C-section by 10 or 11 days after the 10-month period. Okay. Although there is a rumor circulating to the fact that a woman has committed adultery and everyone is gossiping about her, we do not suspect that her children are mamzerim. The rationale is that the person who most frequently has relations with her husband. It is permitted to marry her daughter even as an initial and preferred option, and children are fine. With regard to her own status, we suspect that she is a zayin, if her contact was very lewd, then we also suspect the lineage of her children. Okay. According to scriptural law, a person is suspected of being a mamzer is permitted to marry among the Jewish people. As it states, a mamzer shall not enter God's congregation. And what is implied by that is that one who is definitively a mamzer may not marry among the Jewish people, not one whose status is questionable. Nevertheless, our sages raised the level of purity required with regard to lineage and forbade those of questionable status, from marrying among the Jewish people. And accordingly, a male and a female who are definitely mamzerim may marry each other, but a mamzer whose status a marry of doubt or a shtuki or nasufi are forbidden to marry native Jewesses. Now, can they marry each other? So that's what he says in the next halacha. A man of this latter status is forbidden to marry a female mamzer because he's possibly not a mamzer. He's a suffix mamzer. Even a female mamzer whose status is questionable. So they both have the same status. They're both in doubt. They're not allowed to marry. For perhaps one of them is not a mamzer, but the other is definitely a mamzer. However, a mamzer by rabbinic decree may marry a female mamzer by rabbinic decree. And similarly, in any other instance where a person is allowed to marry because of doubt, one person of this status may not marry another. Okay? So when it's a doubt around a physical, when the doubt is around the status itself, they're not allowed to marry one another. But if they're both in a unique category of a rabbinic decree, then they're allowed. What is implied? Shtukim, asufim, and those whose status as midim is indefinite are forbidden to marry each other. If they marry, the union may not be maintained. Instead, they must divorce with a formal bill of divorce. And the offspring of such relationships are mamzerim with a status like their parents. Individuals of indefinite status like this have no option except to marry converts. And the status of their offspring follows their blemish. What is implied? What do we mean by that? When a shtuki or an asufi marries a female convert or a freed maidservant, a convert or a freed servant marries a female shtuki or sufi, the offspring are shitukim or asufim. When an asufi was found in a city inhabited by Gentiles, so Nebuch, he finds his baby. Whether the majority of Gentiles or the majority are Jews, the child is considered to be a Gentile of indefinite status with regard to his lineage. And if he consecrates a woman, she needs to bill divorce because of the doubt. And if someone kills him, he is not executed for doing so. If the court had immersed the child for the sake of conversion or immersed on his own initiative after he attained majority, his status is the same as any asufi that is found in Jewish cities, and he is allowed to marry, as we said earlier. If the majority of the cities are Gentiles, you can feed him non-kosher meat. If the majority were Jewish, no, we return his lost articles as the laws with regard to Jews. If it's half-half, it's a mitzvah to maintain life. Remove it from the avalanche and Shabbos. With regard to damages, we follow the same principle that apply in all cases of doubt in financial law. When a person who seeks to expropriate money from a colleague, the burden of proof is upon him. Friends, unfortunately, we're going to have to pause here. I'm going to post the link in case you needed it in the chat. 1 second, my chat's not opening. No, it's not opening. Okay. You can just go to chabad.org/daily study and conclude the last few halachas. My apologies. But any questions before we roll?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a beautiful
Rabbi. Have a good
Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, everyone.